The wind cut across the ranch like a cold knife on Halloween night, sending dead leaves skittering across the weathered porch boards. Jedediah Thornton was just about to switch off the porch light when he heard it. Soft footsteps coming up the gravel drive. The girl couldn't have been more than 8, standing there alone in a homemade cowgirl outfit, little boots dusty from the long walk. Her eyes caught him first, that peculiar gray-green just like Sarah's. "Trick or treat," she said, holding out a plastic pumpkin bucket. As Jed fumbled for the candy bowl, moonlight caught something hanging around her neck. A silver dollar with a drill hole swinging on a leather cord. His wedding gift to Sarah, 8 years ago. Headlights suddenly swept across the yard. A Cadillac screeched to a halt, and a woman leapt out, her high heels crunching angrily on the gravel. "Melissa, get in the car right now." As the woman yanked her away, the girl looked back and whispered words that froze Jed's blood. "Mister, are you my real daddy?" Jed couldn't sleep worth a damn. 3 in the morning, and he was still pacing his office, bourbon untouched, the girl's face burning in his mind like a brand. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked away, each click echoing through the empty house. "Mr. Thornton." Mabel Jenkins stood in the doorway, her gray hair loose from its usual bun. The smell of chamomile tea drifted from the mug in her wrinkled hands. "You'll wear a hole through that Navajo rug if you keep on." "Did you see her face, Mabel?" Jed ran calloused fingers through his salt and pepper hair, like looking at Sarah's ghost. "I saw." Mabel set the tea down. "And I saw that necklace too." The silver dollar. His grandfather had pulled it from a poker game in 1923. Jed had drilled a hole through it himself, strung it on a leather cord for Sarah on their wedding day. Something solid to hold on to, he'd told her. She'd worn it every day of their 5-year marriage. The floorboards outside creaked. Hank Williams, his foreman, not the singer, as he liked to joke, filled the doorway, hat in hand. Despite the hour, he smelled of horses and saddle soap. "Ranch don't run itself, boss. You planning on sleeping sometime this decade?" "That girl," Jed said, ignoring him, "had to be Sarah's." "Sarah remarried after you split," Hank reminded him. "Could be her husband's." "Sarah never remarried." Jed's voice was flat. "I'd have known." "A lot of things a man don't know when he buries himself in work for 8 years, Mabel said, her tone gentle but pointed. Dawn found Jed in his truck, crawling past the address the operator had given him. A rental on the edge of town, one of those new subdivisions eating up good grazing land. Wood frame house with a Cadillac in the drive. Same one from last night. Back at the ranch, he'd barely cut the engine when Sheriff Walt Garrison's cruiser rolled up in a cloud of dust. Walt was an old friend. They'd played football together 30 years back, before Walt joined the Texas Rangers. "Morning, Jed." Walt's boots crunched on the gravel. "Figured you'd be asking questions after last night. Thought I'd save you the trouble." They settled on the porch, the morning sun not yet burning off the chill. Mabel brought coffee that smelled strong enough to float a horseshoe. "Victoria Caldwell," Walt said, stirring sugar into his mug. "Sarah's younger sister, moved here 3 months back with the girl. Melissa's her name." Sarah never mentioned a sister. "Half-sister, different fathers." Walt sipped his coffee. "Got the story from Beatrice down at the courthouse. Victoria's got legal guardianship papers for the girl." Jed's mug stopped halfway to his lips. "Guardianship? Not adoption. Guardianship." Walt's eyes met his. "Sarah passed last year. Cancer." The world tilted sideways. Sarah, gone, without a word to him? The coffee turned bitter on his tongue. "Victoria's working as a receptionist at the new medical center," Walt continued. "Keeps to herself mostly. Girls enrolled at Redemption Springs Elementary." "She's what, 8? Jed's voice sounded strange to his own ears. "Born January 12th, 1977. That's according to school records." The math wasn't difficult. Sarah had left in November 76, filed for divorce 2 months later. Never gave a reason beyond, "You love this ranch more than you'll ever love me." A truck door slammed outside. Hank appeared with a thick envelope bearing the Lone Star Oil Company logo, the metal screen door banging shut behind him. "Courier just dropped this off, but Hank said. "Marked urgent." Jed tore it open, scanned the contents, then read aloud. "Per Section 14.3 of our contract, Thornton Ranch's preferential royalty structure requires confirmation of blood heir status for renewal. Without documented succession planning by February 1st, we must invoke the renegotiation clause." The paper crackled in his tightening grip. $5 million in annual oil royalties, the lifeblood that had kept Thornton Ranch thriving when others folded during the bust. Blood heir, Walt repeated carefully. Meaning if I don't have a legitimate child to inherit this ranch, Jed said, I lose the contract that's kept us afloat for 20 years. The three men stared at each other as a cold wind stirred the dead leaves across the porch. The same wind that had blown a little girl to his doorstep on Halloween night. The Cadillac sat in the driveway like a gleaming insult against the modest rental house. Jed sat in his truck for a full 5 minutes, fingers drumming against the steering wheel, building his nerve. The morning was cold enough to see his breath inside the cab. When Victoria Caldwell opened the door, her face hardened like quick-set cement. She wore silk pajamas under a robe that probably cost more than most folks around here made in a month. I wondered how long it would take you. Her voice had Sarah's Texas lilt, but none of her warmth. The house behind her smelled of artificial pine and cigarette smoke poorly masked by perfume. You're trespassing, Mr. Thornton. I need 5 minutes. Jed kept his boot in the doorway. About Melissa. Victoria's laugh could have stripped paint. I've got nothing to say to you. I've got 50,000 reasons you might reconsider. He pulled an envelope from his jacket. The paper crackled in the silence between them. Her eyes narrowed, calculating. A television blared cartoon somewhere inside. Wait here. She returned wearing a silk blouse and slacks, jewelry clinking softly as she stepped onto the porch and pulled the door shut. Her fingernails were painted the same red as her Cadillac. Is she mine? Jed asked, voice rough as horsehair. You don't waste time, do you? Victoria lit a cigarette, the match scraping loud in the morning stillness. Is she mine? Victoria blew smoke toward the bare trees. Sarah died of cancer last year, Jed. She made me promise you'd never know. The world tilted beneath his boots. Know what? About Melissa. She studied his face with cold amusement. What did you think happened when Sarah left? That she just disappeared? She was pregnant, you fool. She knew you didn't want children. Too busy with your precious ranch. That's a damn lie. His voice came out like gravel being crushed. Sarah never told me about any baby. Because you made your position clear. No kids, not now, not ever. This ranch is my legacy. She mimicked his drawl with surgical precision. So she left, raised Melissa alone until the cancer took her. I want a DNA test. Victoria's laugh was brittle as winter wheat. You think you can waltz in after 8 years and play daddy? You think money buys you that right? She flicked her cigarette onto his boot. Get off my property before I call your friend the sheriff. The door slammed like a gunshot, leaving Jed standing there with the envelope still in his hand. 3 days later, Jed sat in Bennett's law office downtown, the leather chair creaking under his weight. Outside the window, Redemption Springs went about its business, farmers and ranchers in for supplies, weekday shoppers hurrying against the cold. She's agreed to meet, Bennett said, adjusting his bow tie. The air smelled of furniture polish and old law books. County clerk's office. Neutral ground. Jed nodded, throat dry. And the test? She's bringing her lawyer. Says she has documentation that'll make testing unnecessary. The county clerk's office felt colder than it should have for a heated building. Victoria sat rigidly at the conference table, a thin man in an expensive suit beside her. Her perfume couldn't mask the mothball smell of the seldom-used meeting room. Mr. Thornton, the lawyer nodded. My client has agreed to this meeting as a courtesy, nothing more. Victoria slid a sealed envelope across the polished table. From Sarah, her final instructions. Bennett opened it carefully, unfolding hospital stationery. His eyes scanned quickly, then again more slowly. It's a deathbed declaration, Bennett said quietly to Jed. Notarized. Sarah states explicitly that you... He faltered. That I what? Jed's voice echoed off the wood-paneled walls. That you are not Melissa's biological father. That you have no paternal rights or claims. Bennett cleared his throat. She names the father as Michael Reeves, with whom she had a brief relationship after leaving you. The floor seemed to drop away. Jed grabbed the edge of the table, the wood grain rough under his fingers. She's lying, he whispered. The document is legal and binding, Victoria's lawyer said. Should you continue to pursue this matter, we'll file harassment charges. I'm sure the good people of Redemption Springs would be fascinated by the great Jedediah Thornton's delusions regarding a child that isn't his. Victoria stood, gathering her purse. The metallic click of its clasp sounded final as a cell door. DNA test or I walk, Jed said, finding his voice. Victoria's smile was thin as a paper cut. Fine. A DNA test, on one condition. When it proves you're not her father, you disappear from our lives forever, and you pay $100,000 for the emotional distress you've caused. Deal. The word fell like an axe. As they walked out into the town square, eyes followed them. Mrs. Peterson from the bakery, Tom Wilson from the feed store, Judge Buford coming down the courthouse steps, all watching the drama unfold like a silent western playing out in real time. Victoria paused at her car. You know what's truly sad, Jed? Sarah actually loved you, right up until the end. She slipped on dark sunglasses despite the cloudy day. She should have known better. Men like you love land more than people. As her Cadillac pulled away, Bennett put a hand on Jed's shoulder. Jez, there's something else. Something about that letter that doesn't add up. The Lone Star Oil Company headquarters in Houston had always struck Jed as a temple to money. All glass and steel, rising 20 stories above the concrete. But today, sitting in the corner office with its view of the downtown skyline, it felt more like a funeral home. Cold, quiet, with the subtle scent of expensive cologne that couldn't quite hide the smell of desperation. Dave Carter, Lone Star's VP of Land Management, tapped manicured fingernails against the polished conference table. The gentle tick-tick-tick reminded Jed of a clock counting down. You understand our position, Mr. Thornton. Carter's voice had the practiced smoothness of a man who delivered bad news for a living. The original contract your grandfather negotiated was exceptional. $5 million annually at 12% royalty is well above market. Hank shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the leather squeaking beneath him. He'd insisted on coming along, though his weathered face and calloused hands looked as out of place here as a rattlesnake in a henhouse. That contract has 30 years left on it, Jed said evenly. Carter nodded. Contingent upon the succession clause. Section 14.3 clearly states that preferential terms are guaranteed only with confirmation of a Thornton blood heir to maintain operational continuity. My ranch manager here has worked that land for 20 years. That's continuity. The language specifically requires blood relation, Mr. Thornton. Carter's smile never reached his eyes. Without documented succession by February 1st, we'll need to renegotiate at current market rates, approximately 4%. The math wasn't difficult. $5 million would become less than $2 million. In the oil-bust economy, with cattle prices where they were, it would mean selling off parcels of land that had been in the Thornton family for 5 generations. Or, Carter continued, we could simply transfer the existing agreement to the Phillips property adjacent to yours. They've expressed interest. The Phillips family. Old rivals who'd been trying to absorb Thornton land since before Jed was born. 3 months, Jed said, standing up. You'll have your confirmation. Outside, the December wind knifed through his jacket. Houston's traffic created a constant background roar, nothing like the peaceful quiet of his ranch. You sure about this? Hank asked, his breath clouding in the cold. Going after a child just for money don't seem like you, boss. Jed watched a businessman hurry past, phone to his ear, oblivious to the world around him. It's not about the money, Hank. If that girl is Sarah's daughter, she's got Thornton blood. That makes her family. And if she ain't yours? The question hung between them like wood smoke on a still day. Then I'll figure something else out, Jed said. But something in my gut says she is. The sheriff's office smelled of coffee and gun oil. Walt's boots were propped on his desk, a case file open in his lap. The radiator clanked and hissed in the corner, fighting against the chill seeping through single-pane windows. Found something interesting, Walt said, not looking up. The wall clock ticked loudly in the silence. Victoria Caldwell's guardianship paperwork. Jed leaned forward. And? It's provisional. Emergency guardianship granted by a judge in Austin. Walt flipped a page. Sarah's will apparently named someone else as guardian, a cousin in California. But Victoria filed for emergency custody when Sarah passed, claiming the cousin couldn't be located. So her custody isn't permanent? 6-month review coming up. Judge Mason over in the county seat handles family court. Walt closed the file. Mason's tough but fair. Might consider a petition for visitation from a potential father, especially one with standing in the community. A hope flickered like a match struck in darkness. You think he'd grant it? With a good lawyer and a DNA test pending? I reckon he might. Walt's chair creaked as he leaned back. But, Jed, you need to ask yourself something. Is this about the oil contract or is it about the girl? The question felt like a spur digging into his side. Can it be both? Not in Mason's courtroom. It can't. Walt's eyes were kind, but direct. He'll smell an ulterior motive, like a bloodhound sniffs rabbits. Mabel was waiting on the porch when Jed pulled up to the ranch house, her shawl wrapped tight against the evening chill. Christmas lights twinkled from the eaves, put up by the hands even though Jed hadn't celebrated properly in years. Bennett called, she said as he climbed the steps. Judge Mason wants to see you tomorrow at 2. Chambers only, no lawyers. Inside, the house felt emptier than usual. Jed hung his hat on the rack by the door, the same spot where his father and grandfather had hung theirs before him. The thought of no Thornton hanging a hat there after him cut deeper than he expected. What if I'm not her father, Mabel? The question slipped out before he could stop it. Mabel's hand on his arm was warm, steady. Then you'll still be the man who tried to do right by Sarah's child. That counts for something in my book. When Bennett called the next evening, Jed was out checking fence lines. The ranch house phone rang 7 times before Mabel picked it up. By the time Jed trudged in, boots heavy with mud, she was waiting with a tumbler of bourbon and a smile that lit up the kitchen. Judge granted supervised visitation, she said, starting this Saturday. The bourbon burned good going down, warming him from the inside out. One chance, Thornton, Bennett had told Mason. Don't make me regret this. Saturday dawned, clear and cold, the kind of Texas winter day that started out brittle, but softened by noon. Jed had been up since 4, too restless to sleep. He'd walked the house a dozen times, straightening what didn't need straightening, cleaning what was already clean. The smell of lemon polish and fresh-baked cookies filled the air, competing with the cedar smoke from the fireplace. You're making me dizzy, Mabel said, watching him pace. Her knitting needles clicked steadily, a sound as familiar to the house as the tick of the grandfather clock. She's an 8-year-old girl, not the Queen of England. What if she hates it here? The question had been eating at him all night. What if she's scared of the horses? What if... The crunch of tires on gravel cut him short. Through the front window, he saw a county car, neutral ground, per the judge's order. The social worker, Mrs. Abernathy, emerged first. Then the back door opened, and a small figure in a red coat stepped out, her breath visible in the cold. Jed wiped suddenly damp palms on his jeans and opened the front door. Up close, the resemblance to Sarah was even stronger. Same determined chin, same way of standing with one hip slightly cocked. The silver dollar still hung around her neck, catching the winter sunlight. Hello, Mr. Thornton. Her voice was clear and steady, no trace of the whisper from Halloween night. Thank you for inviting me to your ranch. Something in Jed's chest twisted, so formal, like she was speaking to a stranger, which, he supposed, he was. Folks around here just call me Jed, he managed. Come on in out of the cold. Mrs. Abernathy, a stern woman with a clipboard and sensible shoes that squeaked against the hardwood, laid out the rules. 4 hours, no leaving the property. She would observe, but not interfere unless necessary. The girl, Melissa, stood in the entryway taking it all in. Her eyes lingered on the photographs lining the hall wall, generations of Thorntons standing proudly before the same white farmhouse. Is that you? She asked, pointing to a faded color photo of a much younger Jed on horseback, trophy in hand. State Rodeo Finals, 1968, he nodded. Broke 3 ribs earning that trophy. Mama had a picture of you riding. The words came out soft, almost to herself. She said you were the best horseman in 3 counties. Jed's breath caught. Your mama said that? Melissa nodded, then seemed to remember herself and looked away. Would you like to see the horses? He asked after an awkward silence. Her face lit up like he'd offered her the moon. Outside, the winter air smelled of hay and horsehide, the familiar scents of Jed's world. They walked to the stables, boots crunching on the gravel path. Mrs. Abernathy followed at a discreet distance, her clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. This here's Domino, Jed said, stopping at the first stall. A black quarter horse with a white blaze stuck his head over the gate, nickering softly. To his surprise, Melissa approached confidently, hand out, palm down the way experienced riders do. Hey there, beautiful, she said. You're a handsome fella, aren't you? Domino sniffed her hand, then allowed her to stroke his nose. She ran her small fingers along his blaze with practiced ease. "You've been around horses before," Jed observed, unable to keep the surprise from his voice. "Mama taught me," she said simply, "before she got sick. We used to go riding at Willow Creek Stables every Saturday." She glanced up at him, then away again quickly. "She said I got my seat from you." The words hit Jed like a physical blow. "What else did your mama tell you about me?" he asked carefully. Melissa's hand stilled on Domino's nose. "That you were a good man who loved the land. That sometimes good people can't stay together, but it doesn't make them bad." From the next stall, a chestnut mare whinnied, sensing the tension. "That's Penny," Jed said, his voice rough. "Gentlest horse on the place. Would you like to ride her?" The smile that broke across Melissa's face was like sunrise after a long night. By the time they returned to the house, Melissa's cheeks were flushed with cold and excitement. She'd handled Penny like she was born to it, posting to the trot without instruction, guiding the mare with the lightest touch of the reins. "Mama had your picture hidden in her Bible," she said, as they stomped snow from their boots at the back door. "I found it after she was gone. She wrote something on the back." "What did it say?" Jed asked, his heart hammering against his ribs. Melissa looked up at him, those gray-green eyes solemn. It said, "The good man who loved the land too much to leave it." Inside, Mabel had hot chocolate waiting, the rich smell filling the kitchen. Mrs. Abernathy checked her watch and announced that 2 of the 4 hours had passed. "Can I come back?" Melissa asked as they sat at the kitchen table, warming their hands on ceramic mugs. "Next time maybe we could ride to the creek?" "I'd like that," Jed said, surprised by the thickness in his throat. "Very much." The rest of the visit passed in a blur, showing her the tack room, the old photos in the study, the view from the upstairs window where you could see clear to the mountain ridge on a good day. She soaked it all in with quiet intensity, asking questions that showed a mind as sharp as a tack. When the county car pulled away 4 hours later, Jed stood on the porch long after it had disappeared, the cold seeping into his bones, unnoticed. "She's yours," Mabel said, appearing at his elbow. "DNA or no DNA, that child has Thornton written all over her." 3 days before Christmas, Victoria requested an emergency hearing. The courthouse was nearly empty, most folks busy with holiday preparations. Bennett met Jed at the entrance, his expression grim. "She's got something up her sleeve," he warned as they climbed the marble steps. "Filed a motion this morning with sealed medical records attached." Judge Buford's chambers smelled of pine air freshener and stale coffee. Victoria sat with her lawyer, her face a mask of cold triumph. When Jed entered, she smiled like a cat that had cornered a mouse. "Let's get straight to it," Judge Buford said, settling his considerable bulk behind his desk. "Ms. Caldwell has submitted new evidence she claims makes DNA testing unnecessary." Victoria's lawyer slid a folder across the polished desk. "Medical records, Your Honor, from Houston Methodist Hospital dated June 1975. Mr. Thornton underwent a vasectomy 18 months before Ms. Morrison's conception." The floor seemed to drop away beneath Jed's feet. "Furthermore," the lawyer continued over the roaring in Jed's ears, "we have signed affidavits from Mrs. Sarah Morrison's oncologist, confirming statements she made during her final illness about the child's parentage." Victoria leaned forward. "We had fertility treatments you never knew about, Jed. Sarah tried to tell you, but you were too busy with your precious ranch. By the time it took, your marriage was already over." The drive back to the ranch passed in a blur. Jed barely registered the Christmas decorations lining Main Street, the cheerful lights seeming to mock him. The truck's heater struggled against the cold, its fan creating a steady background hum that couldn't drown out Victoria's words echoing in his head. "We had fertility treatments you never knew about." Was it possible? Had Sarah gone through all that alone, never telling him? He'd been so absorbed in the ranch back then, fighting to modernize after his father's death, battling the bank through the early 80s slump. There had been weeks he'd barely seen Sarah, leaving before dawn, returning after she was asleep. The house was dark when he pulled up, Mabel having gone to her sister's for Christmas shopping. Good. He couldn't bear sympathy right now. The floorboards creaked under his boots as he made his way to his father's liquor cabinet, the crystal decanter cold in his hand. Bourbon splashed amber into the glass, its rich aroma filling his nostrils. He drank standing up, staring at the wedding photo on the mantel, Sarah in white, looking up at him with such hope, such faith. The glass shattered against the fireplace bricks before he even realized he'd thrown it. Dawn found him in the attic, dust motes dancing in the weak winter light that filtered through the single window. He hadn't planned to come up here, had avoided it for years, in fact. This was where Sarah's things had been stored after the divorce, when he couldn't bear to look at them, but couldn't bring himself to throw them away. Cardboard boxes labeled in her neat handwriting. Books. Summer clothes. Photos. His hands moved of their own accord, opening lids, stirring up smells that transported him back. Her lavender sachets, the faint trace of the perfume she'd worn. A smaller box in the corner caught his eye. No label, sealed with yellowing tape. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper gone brittle with age, lay a pair of bronzed baby boots, the kind parents make from their child's first shoes. A small card nestled between them, Sarah's handwriting instantly recognizable. For the baby we wanted. Someday, maybe. The date on the card, April 1906, 6 months before she left. Something broke loose inside Jed's chest, a dam he'd built over 8 years, holding back everything he hadn't allowed himself to feel. He sank to his knees among the dusty boxes, the tiny boots clutched in his calloused hands, and did something he hadn't done since his father died. He wept. "Maybe I don't deserve her, Mabel," Jed said quietly. They sat at the kitchen table, steam rising from coffee mugs, the bronzed boots between them like a monument to what might have been. Outside, a cold rain tapped against the windows, the sound amplified by the tin roof over the porch. "But I'll be damned if I'll let her grow up thinking I didn't want her." Mabel's weathered hand covered his. "Children need love more than they need perfect parents, Jedediah Thornton. Lord knows my own daddy was as flawed as they come, but he loved us fierce. That's what mattered in the end." What if the DNA test comes back negative? The question that had been haunting him for weeks. Then you've got a choice to make. Mabel's eyes were kind, but unflinching. "Is this about an oil contract, or is it about that little girl?" Hank's boots thumped on the porch before Jed could answer, followed by the squeak of the screen door. The foreman's face was grim under his dripping hat. "Bennett's on the phone," he said. "Says it's urgent." In the study, rain lashing the windows, Jed held the receiver to his ear. Bennett's voice crackled with static from the storm. "Victoria's filed for sole permanent guardianship," the lawyer said without preamble. "She's also filed a restraining order against any further contact pending the outcome of the DNA test." Can she do that? Judge Mason's allowing it, given the uncertainty. But Jed, there's something else. Bennett paused. "I did some digging into those medical records. The vasectomy is real enough. The hospital confirmed it. But I spoke with a specialist. Even with a vasectomy, there's a small failure rate, less than 1%, but it happens." Hope flickered, frail as a candle in a windstorm. "So I could still be—" "It's possible. Remote, but possible. And there's more. Those fertility treatments Victoria mentioned, no record of Sarah ever receiving them. Not at Methodist, not at any clinic in Houston." The line crackled with silence. "So Victoria lied?" "I can't prove that yet," Bennett cautioned. "But I've requested Sarah's complete medical records. If she did undergo fertility treatment, it'll be documented somewhere." After hanging up, Jed stood at the window, watching the rain turn the ranch yard to mud. The decision crystallized, clear as the ice forming on the puddles outside. "Get Sheriff Walt on the phone," he told Hank, "and then call Dave Carter at Lone Star Oil." By evening, the pieces were in motion. The DNA test was scheduled for the day after Christmas. The restraining order meant no more visits until the results came back. But Jed had made his peace with that. He had a plan now. Blood or not, she's Sarah's daughter, he told Walt over a late-night coffee laced with bourbon. The kitchen was warm against the cold night, the smell of wood smoke and leather comforting in its familiarity. "And that makes her family to me." Word of Jed Thornton's custody battle spread through Redemption Springs faster than a prairie fire. Small towns run on gossip like trucks run on diesel, and by mid-December, everyone had an opinion. The Rexall drug counter buzzed with whispers. The Piggly Wiggly checkout line hummed with speculation. Even the Sunday church service wasn't immune, with sideways glances and hushed conversations whenever Jed walked in. "Heard he's only doing it for the oil money," Jed overheard Mrs. Peterson saying to the butcher as he waited for his order. Her voice carried in the small shop, the clack of her dentures punctuating each word. "His contract's got some clause about having an heir." The butcher's cleaver came down hard on a side of beef, the thwack making Jed flinch. "Man his age, what's he know about raising a little girl? Barely raised his own self from what I hear." Jed grabbed his package and left without responding, the bell over the door jangling angrily behind him. The cold December air bit at his face, carrying the scent of wood smoke and coming snow. Victoria worked the town like a politician campaigning for office. Jed would drive past the Coffee Cup Cafe and see her holding court, leaning in close to the town's busybodies, her voice too low to hear, but her intentions clear as glass. The few times they crossed paths, she'd smile that shark smile of hers, the silver bracelets on her wrist tinkling like warning bells. The elementary school Christmas pageant should have been neutral territory. Jed hadn't planned to go, wasn't even sure if he was welcome, but Bennett had suggested it would look good to the judge. Show interest in her activities, he'd said. Community events are fair game under the visitation restrictions. The school gymnasium smelled of floor wax and pine garlands, folding chairs squeaking under the weight of proud parents. Jed stood awkwardly at the back, hat in hand, scanning the program for Melissa's name. She was playing an angel in the nativity scene. "Mr. Thornton," Principal Davis appeared at his elbow, his voice quiet but firm. "I need to speak with you outside." In the hallway, surrounded by construction paper snowflakes and children's artwork, Davis looked uncomfortable but determined. Behind him, the muffled sound of children singing Silent Night filtered through the closed doors. "I've received a call from Victoria Caldwell," Davis said. "She's invoked the restraining order. I'm afraid I have to ask you to leave." "The order's about private contact," Jed protested. "This is a public event." "She's provided documentation indicating you're not on the approved guardian list for school functions." Davis's eyes darted away. "I'm sorry, Jed. I can't risk the school's legal position." As he trudged back to his truck, Jed saw Victoria watching from the gymnasium entrance, triumph written across her face. Snow had started to fall, fat flakes melting as they hit the asphalt. Sheriff Walt showed up at the ranch 2 days before Christmas, his cruiser fishtailing slightly on the icy drive. His face was grim beneath his Stetson, but there was a spark in his eyes that Jed recognized from their high school football days, the look Walt got when he'd spotted a weakness in the opposing team's defense. "Got something," he said, stomping snow from his boots in the mudroom. His uniform smelled of cold air and coffee. "Took some digging, but I called in a favor with a buddy at the Austin PD." At the kitchen table, Walt spread out bank statements and court documents. The furnace kicked on, humming steadily against the deepening cold outside. "Victoria Caldwell has gambling debts," he said, tapping a highlighted line. "Big ones, to the tune of $60,000. "Gambling?" Jed frowned. "To who?" "That's where it gets interesting. The markers are held by Cottonwood Development Corporation." The name rang a bell. Jed had seen their billboards on the highway, luxury subdivisions, golf courses, the kind of development that was eating up ranch land across the county. "They're the same outfit that's been trying to buy the old Phillips place," Walt continued. "Been eyeing your water rights, too, from what I hear." Realization dawned cold and clear. "She's not after child support." Walt nodded grimly. "She's after the whole damned ranch." "But how?" "Think about it, Jed. If that DNA test comes back positive, Melissa stands to inherit one of the largest working ranches in the county, plus oil rights worth millions. As her legal guardian, Victoria would control all that until Melissa turns 18. Jed's mind raced ahead. "And if the test is negative?" "Then you're still over a barrel with the oil company contract. No heir, no renewal." Walt leaned forward. "Either way, you're vulnerable. And I'd bet my badge Cottonwood knows it." "We need proof," Jed said, standing suddenly. "Something concrete to take to the judge." "Already working on it." Walt gathered the papers. "My buddy's pulling Victoria's bank records. If she's been talking to Cottonwood about Thornton Ranch, there'll be a trail." As Walt's cruiser disappeared down the drive, Mabel appeared at Jed's side, a steaming mug in her hands. The rich aroma of her special hot chocolate, the kind she only made in times of crisis, filled his nostrils. "You heard?" he asked. She nodded. "Every word. Never did trust that woman, eyes too close together." She handed him the mug. "What will you do if that DNA test comes back and she's not yours?" The chocolate burned his tongue, sweet and bitter at once. "Doesn't matter what that test says. Sarah believed Melissa was mine. That's good enough for me." Christmas Eve fell cold and quiet over Thornton Ranch. Jed stood at his office window, watching the last light fade from a gunmetal sky. The DNA test results lay unopened on his desk, delivered by courier an hour before. The manila envelope seemed to pulse with its own gravity, pulling everything in the room toward it. He'd expected Bennett to be there when it arrived, but the lawyer was stuck in Dallas with family. Walt was handling a pileup on the interstate. It was just Jed and the truth, waiting to meet each other. "You gonna open that thing, or just stare it to death?" Mabel stood in the doorway, her voice gentle. The house behind her smelled of pine needles and gingerbread, concessions to a holiday Jed hadn't properly celebrated in years. What if it says, "I'm not her father"? The question that had haunted him for weeks finally spoken aloud. Mabel crossed the room, her slippers whispering against the hardwood. She picked up the envelope, then placed it back down with deliberate care. "Blood don't make you a father, Jed," she said. "What you do next does." The grandfather clock in the hall struck 7, each chime reverberating through the quiet house. With fingers that didn't feel like his own, Jed tore open the envelope. The medical language was dense, but the conclusion was clear: 98% probability of paternity. The room tilted, then steadied. Something long knotted in his chest began to unravel. "She's mine," he whispered, his voice rough. "She's really mine." Mabel's arms came around him, her familiar scent of lavender and baking flour enveloping him as he hadn't allowed since he was a boy. "Never doubted it for a minute." Bennett called from Dallas 30 minutes later, his voice tinny through the speakerphone. The connection crackled with static from the weather system moving in. "I've already filed the results with the court," he said. "Given the conclusive nature, we can petition for immediate joint custody, pending a full hearing after the holidays." "What about Victoria's guardianship?" "That's where it gets complicated. The original will naming the cousin as guardian takes precedence legally, but since Victoria has had physical custody for over a year, the court will consider the status quo. Best case scenario, you get joint custody to start, then we build toward primary custody based on Victoria's unsuitability." "How long?" "Months. Maybe longer. Courts don't rush these things, Jed. Children aren't oil leases." The words stung, but Jed knew they were fair. "I want to see her tomorrow. It's Christmas." "I'll call Judge Mason first thing in the morning," Bennett promised. "But Jed, tread carefully. The law is on your side now, but one wrong move could set us back months." After hanging up, Jed sat motionless, listening to the wind picking up outside. The weatherman had been warning about an ice storm, rare for this part of Texas. The temperature was dropping fast, the wind carrying the sharp smell of coming precipitation. Sheriff Walt's cruiser pulled up just after 10, its headlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights. The banging of the screen door echoed through the quiet house as Walt burst in without knocking, tracking melting ice across the entryway. "Victoria's gone," he said without preamble. "Packed up the house, pulled Melissa out of school yesterday. Neighbor saw them loading the Cadillac around dusk." Cold dread washed over Jed. "Gone where?" "Don't know for sure." Walt's uniform smelled of wet wool and road salt. "But she closed her bank account, emptied her safe deposit box. Classic flight preparation." "She can't just take her." Jed's voice rose, echoing off the high ceiling. "The DNA test means nothing until a judge modifies the custody order." Walt's face was grim. "But I've put out an APB based on the restraining order violation. She'll have to pass through one of 3 counties to get to the interstate." Mabel appeared with coffee, her face tight with worry. "That storm's getting worse by the minute. They're saying on the radio it could be the worst ice event in 20 years. As if in confirmation, the lights flickered, then steadied. "I need to find them." Jed grabbed his coat from the hook. "She can't disappear with my daughter." Walt's hand on his arm was firm. "You go charging off half-cocked, you'll just make things worse. Let me handle this." An hour crawled by, then another. The storm worsened, ice pellets tapping against the windows like tiny fists. The roads would be getting dangerous, sheets of black ice hidden under fresh snow. Jed paced the length of the house, stopping at each window to peer into the darkness, seeing nothing but his own reflection. When the phone rang just after midnight, he lunged for it. "Found them," Walt said without preamble. "Highway Patrol spotted the Cadillac at the Conoco on Route 16. They're bringing them to the ranch. Roads are too bad to make it back to town safely." "Is she okay, Melissa?" "Scared, but fine. Victoria's not under arrest. Technically, she hasn't broken any laws yet, but I've explained that removing the child from the jurisdiction during a pending custody case wouldn't look good to a judge." Jed hung up and stepped onto the porch, the cold air burning his lungs. Ice coated every surface, transforming the ranch into a crystal wonderland that would be beautiful if it weren't so deadly. The security lights reflected off the frozen landscape, creating an eerie twilight glow. Headlights appeared at the end of the long drive, moving slowly. Not Walt's cruiser, but a highway patrol car, chains on its tires, crunching through the ice. Behind it, barely visible in the swirling snow, Victoria's Cadillac followed. The patrol car stopped first. The back door opened, and Melissa emerged, clutching a small suitcase. Even from the porch, Jed could see she was crying. When she spotted him, she hesitated, then broke into a run, her boots slipping on the icy path. Victoria's voice cut it through the night. "Melissa, get back in the car right now." But Melissa kept running, her breath coming in white puffs, the silver dollar bouncing against her chest. When she reached the steps, Jed knelt down, opening his arms without thinking. She crashed into him with the force of 8 years of absence, her small body shaking with sobs. "She was taking me away," she whispered against his shoulder. "She said we had to leave before you could steal me." "Nobody's stealing anybody," Jed said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. He looked past her to where Victoria stood by her Cadillac, fury etched on her face. Beyond her, the highway patrolman and Sheriff Walt conferred in the falling snow. "You're safe now." As he guided Melissa into the warmth of the house, the power failed, plunging the ranch into darkness save for the firelight spilling from the living room. Outside, the ice continued to fall, sealing them all in place until morning. Daybreak brought no relief from the storm. Ice had encased the ranch like glass, transforming fence posts into crystal sculptures and weighing down power lines until they sagged dangerously low. The temperature had dropped to 18 degrees, brutal by Texas standards, and the generator hummed steadily behind the house, providing just enough electricity for the essentials. Jed found Melissa in the kitchen with Mabel, her small hands wrapped around a mug of hot chocolate. In the pale morning light filtering through frosted windows, she looked smaller, more vulnerable. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, but she offered a tentative smile when he entered. "Where's Victoria?" he asked Mabel quietly. "Guest room. Hasn't come out yet." Mabel's tone made her opinion of Victoria clear. She set a plate of biscuits on the table, the smell of fresh-baked bread a comfort against the howling wind outside. A sharp knock rattled the back door. Hank burst in, bringing a blast of Arctic air and the smell of wet wool. Ice crystals clung to his mustache, melting as he stomped his boots on the mat. "We got trouble in the south pasture," he said without preamble. "Marla's calving." Jed cursed under his breath. Marla was his prize Hereford, worth more than most of the trucks on the property. She wasn't due for another week, but the storm must have stressed her into early labor. "How bad?" "Breach presentation from what I can tell. Doc Peterson can't get out here. Route 16's closed from fallen trees." Hank's weathered face was grim. "We're on our own." "I'll get my gear." Jed turned, then stopped, noticing Melissa listening intently. "You stay here with Mabel, where it's warm." Melissa set her mug down with deliberate care. "I can help. I know about calving." "This is dangerous, sweetheart. The cow's in trouble, and Mama and I helped at the Mason Ranch last spring." Her chin lifted in a way that was pure Sarah. "I held the legs while Mr. Mason pulled. The calf lived." Jed and Hank exchanged glances. "Extra pair of hands couldn't hurt," Hank said quietly. 20 minutes later, bundled in one of Jed's old work coats cut down by Mabel's quick scissors, Melissa sat beside him in the ranch truck. The heater blasted against the cold, the wipers fighting a losing battle against the ice. Each breath clouded the air inside the cab. "Scared?" Jed asked as they bounced down the service road, chains on the tires crunching through the ice. She nodded, honest. "But Mama always said being scared isn't a reason not to do something important." Something caught in Jed's throat. "Your mama was a smart woman." The barn loomed ahead, its red paint stark against the white landscape. Inside, warmed slightly by the bodies of 24 cattle, Marla lay on her side in a bed of straw, sides heaving with effort. 2 ranch hands stood nearby, their breath visible in the cold air. "One hoof presenting," Tomas, the younger hand, reported. "Can't find the other." Jed knelt in the straw, feeling Melissa hovering just behind his shoulder. The smell of cattle and hay filled the air, familiar and urgent. He'd delivered hundreds of calves over the years, but this one would be tricky. Without the second hoof coming first, the calf could suffocate before it fully emerged. "We need to push it back in and reposition," he said, rolling up his sleeve. "Hank, get the chains." Melissa knelt beside him, her face serious. "Mr. Mason used olive oil as lubricant." Jed nodded. "Hank, there's mineral oil in the medical kit." Working together, they repositioned the calf while Marla bellowed her distress, the sound echoing off the barn's high ceiling. Jed's hands, slick with oil and birth fluids, found the second leg tucked under the calf's body. With careful pressure, he extended it alongside the first. "Now we pull," he told Melissa, looping chains around the protruding hooves. Steady pressure in time with her contractions. What happened next unfolded in a blur of effort and instinct. Melissa anchored the chains, her small body braced against a post, face tight with concentration. When Jed called directions, she responded instantly, as if they'd worked together for years instead of minutes. "Now!" he called, as Marla's sides tensed with another contraction. They pulled together, the calf inching forward, once, twice. On the third contraction, the calf slid free in a rush of fluid and afterbirth, landing in the straw with a wet thud. It lay motionless, alarmingly still. Melissa moved before Jed could, grabbing a clean towel and rubbing the calf vigorously, clearing mucus from its nose and mouth. "Come on," she whispered. "Breathe." The calf's chest heaved suddenly, and it gave a weak, sputtering cough. Melissa continued rubbing, her small hands sure and confident, until the calf lifted its head and bawled, the most beautiful sound in the world to any rancher. "You did it," Jed said softly. Melissa looked up at him, face flushed with effort and pride. "We did it." Something shifted between them in that moment, a connection beyond DNA, beyond courts and custody battles, something bone deep and true as the land itself. The walk back to the house was silent, the storm having settled into a steady sleet that pinged against their coats. Melissa's hand found his, small fingers twining through his calloused ones with surprising strength. "Mama was right about you," she said suddenly. "What do you mean?" "She said you had hands that remembered how to save things." Melissa looked up at him, ice crystals catching in her eyelashes. I didn't understand what she meant until now. The house was tense when they returned. Victoria stood in the living room, arms crossed, while Sheriff Walt sat at the dining table with a stack of papers spread before him. The fire popped and hissed in the hearth, the only sound in the charged silence. "Where have you been?" Victoria demanded, eyes narrowing at their dirty clothes and the blood staining Jed's sleeve. "Saving a calf," Melissa answered, her voice steady. "A mama cow needed help." Victoria's lips thinned. "Go clean up. We're leaving as soon as the road's clear." "Nobody's going anywhere just yet," Walt said, his tone deceptively mild. The sheriff's badge caught the firelight as he tapped a document with his finger. "Ms. Caldwell and I have been having an interesting conversation about Cottonwood development." Jed helped Melissa out of the oversized coat, buying time as his mind raced. "What about them? Seems they're mighty interested in Thornton water rights." Walt's eyes never left Victoria's face. "Offered a tidy sum for an option to purchase, contingent on certain legal matters being resolved." Victoria's laugh was brittle. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "No?" Walt slid a paper across the table. "This contract with your signature says otherwise. Dated 9 months ago, 3 months before Sarah passed." The color drained from Victoria's face. "That's not... You can't..." "Bank records don't lie, ma'am. Neither do phone logs." Walt's voice hardened. "You've been in contact with Cottonwood Development since before Sarah's diagnosis, before you had any claim to guardianship." Melissa looked between the adults, confusion giving way to understanding. "You were going to sell the ranch, Mama's home?" "You don't understand," Victoria snapped. "Your mother was dying. She couldn't think straight, filling your head with sentimental nonsense about cowboys and ranches. She had nothing but that worthless silver dollar and a pile of medical debt." "That's why you hid the letters," Melissa said quietly, the pieces falling into place. "The ones Mama wrote to Mr. Thornton before she died." Jed's head jerked up. "What letters?" Victoria laughed, a harsh sound like breaking glass. "You think Sarah wanted to see you? After you chose this piece of dirt over her?" "Victoria took Mama's letters," Melissa said, her voice small but clear. "I found them in her suitcase last night when she was packing. She told Mama you didn't want us, but Mama didn't believe her. That's why she gave me your silver dollar, so I'd find you someday." Judge Mason's courtroom was as austere as the man himself. High ceilings, polished oak benches worn smooth by generations of worried backsides, and windows that let in February light without much of its warmth. The smell of lemon polish and old books hung in the air, underscored by the faint scent of coffee from the judge's chambers. 2 weeks had passed since the ice storm. 2 weeks of temporary custody arrangements, supervised visits, and lawyers' meetings. Victoria sat on one side of the courtroom, her face a mask of injured dignity. The Cottonwood Development representative, a slick-haired man in an expensive suit, had mysteriously disappeared back to Austin once Sheriff Walt's investigation began. "All rise," the bailiff called, his voice echoing in the hushed room. "The Honorable Judge Samuel Mason presiding." Judge Mason moved with the deliberate pace of a man who'd seen too many families torn apart by the very system meant to protect them. His robes rustled as he settled behind the bench, the sound like dry leaves in autumn. "This is an unusual case," he began, peering over reading glasses. "I've reviewed the evidence submitted by both parties. I've spoken with the child in my chambers, and I've considered the recommendations of the appointed guardian ad litem." Jed's collar felt too tight, his Sunday suit stiff and unfamiliar. Bennett had insisted he dress the part today. Show the judge you respect his courtroom. Beside him, Melissa sat straight-backed in a blue dress, her hair neatly braided by Mabel that morning. The silver dollar hung around her neck, catching the light when she moved. "Ms. Caldwell," the judge continued, "while your emergency guardianship was properly granted following your sister's death, several troubling facts have emerged." Victoria shifted in her seat, her bracelets clinking softly. Financial records indicate unauthorized use of funds from the minor child's trust. Phone records show contact with development companies regarding property in which the child has interest prior to your sister's passing. Judge Mason's voice remained even, but his eyes were hard. "Most concerning is the evidence of deliberately intercepted correspondence between the deceased and Mr. Thornton." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Redemption Springs had turned out in force. Mrs. Peterson from the bakery, Tom Wilson from the feed store, even Principal Davis, all watching the drama unfold with avid interest. "I'd like to hear from Melissa Morrison," Judge Mason said, gesturing to the witness stand. Melissa's shoes squeaked against the polished floor as she made her way forward. Once sworn in, she looked so small behind the wooden railing, but her voice carried clear and strong. "Tell me about the letters you found," Judge Mason prompted. "They were in Mama's Bible. 3 of them, addressed to Mr. Thornton, to my daddy." Melissa's fingers went to the silver dollar. "Mama told me if anything happened to her, I should find him. She said he didn't know about me, but that wasn't his fault." "And what did you do with these letters?" "I showed them to Aunt Victoria." Melissa's eyes flicked briefly to her aunt. "She took them, said she'd mail them, but then she told me he didn't want us." "Yet you sought him out on Halloween." Melissa nodded. "I heard Aunt Victoria talking to a man about selling the ranch, Mama's home. She said once the guardianship was permanent, they could liquidate the assets. I didn't know what that meant, but I knew it was bad." Judge Mason steepled his fingers. "And the silver dollar?" "Mama said it was a wedding gift, that Daddy drilled the hole himself so she could wear it close to her heart." Melissa's voice wavered for the first time. "She gave it to me before she died, said it would lead me home someday." In the heavy silence that followed, Jed felt something in his chest crack open. Grief and joy mingled so completely he couldn't separate them. When the testimony concluded, Judge Mason removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "I've heard enough. Victoria Caldwell's guardianship is hereby terminated. Full legal and physical custody of Melissa Morrison is granted to her biological father, Jedediah Thornton." Victoria's outraged cry was lost in the swell of voices as the courtroom erupted. Judge Mason banged his gavel once, restoring order. "Furthermore, Ms. Caldwell will repay all misappropriated funds from the child's trust with interest. The district attorney will review evidence for potential criminal charges regarding the intercepted correspondence." When it was over, when the papers were signed and congratulations offered, Jed and Melissa stood on the courthouse steps in the weak February sunshine. The air held a hint of warming, the first tentative promise of spring. "What happens now?" Melissa asked, her hand small but steady in his. "Now we go home," Jed said simply. The following Sunday, Jed stood in the ranch house entryway, watching as Melissa carefully placed her boots beside his by the door, her new riding boots next to his weathered ones. On the mantel above the fireplace, the silver dollar now rested in a custom display case alongside the original Thornton land deed. "Miss Mabel says dinner's ready," she called from the kitchen, where the smell of pot roast filled the air. "She says to wash up or face the consequences." Jed smiled. 3 weeks, and already the house felt different. Lived in, warmed by something beyond the fire in the hearth. On his desk, the Lone Star Oil Company contract lay signed and renewed, the blood air clause satisfied. Dave Carter had practically fallen over himself making concessions once the custody ruling came through. Outside, the first green shoots pushed through the soil in what would become Melissa's garden. She'd asked to plant vegetables, like Mama and I used to, in the south-facing plot that had lain fallow for years. From the dining room came the sounds of chairs scraping, plates clinking, not just Mabel today, but Hank and his wife, Sheriff Walt, even old Doc Peterson, the beginnings of what Melissa called their Sunday family dinner. "You coming, Daddy?" Her voice drifted from the kitchen, the words still new enough to catch in his throat. "Be right there," he called back, taking one last look at the silver dollar gleaming in its case, the unlikely compass that had led his daughter home. February gave way to March, then April, the Texas hill country shedding its winter coat like an old horse losing its winter fur. The creek that ran through the south pasture swelled with snowmelt from the mountains, gurgling and chuckling over smooth stones. Wildflowers pushed up through warming soil, bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush splashing color across the land like God's own paintbrush had gone wild. Every morning, Jed and Melissa walked the fence line together. It became their ritual, these dawn patrols, her small boots leaving prints alongside his larger ones. She asked questions about everything: the names of birds, why fence posts were set at particular angles, how to tell good grazing from bad. Not by lookin', but by knowin', he'd tell her, crouching to pinch soil between his fingers, showing her how to read the land like others read books. The spring calving brought 19 new lives to Thornton Ranch. Melissa named each one, recording their lineage in a notebook with careful penmanship. The calf they'd saved during the ice storm, now a sturdy, growing heifer, she'd named Hope. Seemed fitting, somehow. "Will I inherit all this someday?" she asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the hills gold and crimson. Her voice held no greed, only genuine curiosity. "God willin', and the creek don't rise," Jed answered, the old saying coming naturally to his lips. "Though there's plenty I aim to teach you before that day comes." In the new tack room, built after the old one finally surrendered to age and termites, Jed had hung the bronzed baby boots beside a framed photograph of Sarah. Melissa often stood there, talking to her mama's picture as if continuing a conversation only briefly interrupted. Sometimes Jed would find her there, silver dollar in hand, telling Sarah about her day. Lone Star Oil sent their contract manager in May, earlier than required, eager to solidify relations with the Thornton heir. The man looked startled when Melissa joined them at the dining table, asking pointed questions about production percentages and environmental protections. "She's got her mother's heart and her grandfather's head for business," Jed explained, not bothering to hide his pride. Victoria pleaded guilty to lesser charges, avoiding jail time, but leaving Texas as part of her plea agreement. The Cottonwood development signs came down from neighboring properties, their grand plans for luxury living withering once the water rights option evaporated. On a perfect spring morning in late May, Jed stood watching Melissa guide her horse through the east pasture, her form perfect, her face alight with joy. A meadowlark trilled from a nearby fence post, the sweet notes rising clear in the morning air. "Reckon some treasures come trick-or-treatin' when you least expect 'em," he said aloud to the listening sky, to Sarah, perhaps to himself. "And them's the ones worth changing your whole life for." The land endured, as it always had, through drought and plenty, ice storms and spring rains. But the legacy of Thornton Ranch, Jed now understood, wasn't in the soil or the oil beneath it. It was in what took root in the heart, what was planted in the next generation. That evening, as fireflies began their dance across the darkening pasture, Jed and Melissa sat together on the porch swing, its chains creaking a gentle rhythm. No words needed, just the shared warmth of family found, the promise of tomorrow stretching before them like the wide Texas sky.